He handed a stranger a love letter that wasn't meant for him, and by the time he realized his mistake, it was already too late to take back what had started. Elias Marlowe was just a courier. A nobody who rode his bicycle through the rain-soaked streets of a coastal town, delivering things he was never supposed to care about. But this letter was different. It carried 3 years of unspoken longing, written by a man too afraid to say the words himself. Elias was only supposed to deliver it and disappear. He never imagined the man who opened that door would look at him, not the letter, not the name signed at the bottom, but him, like he was the only person who had ever truly seen him. What began as a simple delivery became a secret neither of them could outrun, a truth that would break one heart to save another, and a choice that would decide who truly deserved to be loved. But what happened next changed his life forever. The town of Belhaven sat where the cliffs met the sea, a place where the fog rolled in every evening like a held breath finally released, curling around the lampposts and softening the edges of the old stone buildings until the whole town looked like a memory rather than a place people actually lived. Elias Marlowe had grown up in the shadow of its lighthouse, and by 26 he had learned every crooked street and shortcut well enough to navigate them blind, which was useful, because half the year Belhaven's fog made blindness the default condition of living there. He worked as a courier, the last one in a town that still believed in handwritten things, pedaling his bicycle between the post office and the doorsteps of people who trusted him with envelopes, packages, and occasionally, secrets. He liked the work. It asked nothing of him but reliability, and reliability was the one thing Elias had never failed to give anyone, even when no one had ever given it back to him. He had a wound he did not speak of, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet in the way that wounds become when they've been carried long enough to feel like posture instead of pain. His father had left when Elias was 9, not through death or tragedy, but through the plain, unremarkable act of walking out one Tuesday morning and never returning, leaving behind a boy who grew into a man convinced that if he simply became indispensable enough, useful enough, present enough, no one would ever have a reason to leave him again. It was why he delivered letters that weren't his with the same care he might have given his own. It was why, when Theo Reyes came to him on a Thursday evening with trembling hands and an envelope sealed 3 times over, Elias didn't ask many questions. He simply said yes. Theo worked at the harbor, hauling nets and repairing hulls, a broad-shouldered man with a gentle voice that never matched his hands that were scarred and rope-burned from a decade of honest labor. He had loved Sebastian Cole for 3 years without ever once telling him, watching him from across the pier where Sebastian sometimes walked in the evenings, alone, his coat collar turned up against the wind. Theo did not have the words. He had never been good with words, had left school at 15 to work the boats, and every time he tried to write down what he felt, the sentences came out flat and childish, nothing like the ocean of feeling underneath them. So one night, over cheap whiskey in the back room of the Anchor and Rope, Theo confessed his secret to Elias, who he'd known since boyhood, and asked for a favor that would unravel everything neither of them could yet see coming. Would Elias help him write the letter? Just this once. Just to get the words right. Elias should have said no. He told himself that later, many times, lying awake with the guilt settling into his chest like sediment. But Theo's eyes had been so raw, so exposed, that Elias found himself reaching for paper before he'd even agreed out loud. And once he started writing, something happened that he did not expect. The words came easily. Too easily. He wrote about a man he had never met, using only the fragments Theo gave him, the quality of Sebastian's silence, the way he always paused at the edge of the pier as though deciding whether to keep walking into the sea or turn back toward the town, the sadness that clung to him like fog clings to Belhaven's rooftops, and from those fragments, Elias built a portrait so vivid it startled him. He told himself it was simply skill. He was good with language the way Theo was good with rope and tide. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't mean anything, because he had never even seen this Sebastian Cole with his own eyes. The letter took 4 nights to finish. Theo signed it, folded it, sealed it 3 times because his hands would not stop shaking, and then, on the 5th night, he came to Elias with a request that would set everything in motion. He could not deliver it himself. If Sebastian rejected him, Theo said, he needed to not be standing there to see it happen, he needed the humiliation to happen at a distance he could survive. So he asked Elias to be the one to place it in Sebastian's hands, the courier, the neutral party, the man with no stake in the outcome. Elias agreed, because that was what Elias did. He carried things for other people and asked for nothing in return, and if some small, unacknowledged part of him was curious to see the face behind the fragments he'd turned into feeling, he did not let himself examine that curiosity too closely. Sebastian Cole lived in a narrow house at the top of Anchor Street, a house with green shutters and a piano visible through the front window, an instrument far too fine for a house that modest, as though the piano had arrived first and the house had been built quietly around it. He was 29, and he restored pianos for a living, coaxing music back into instruments that other people had given up on, spending his days with his hands inside the wooden bodies of things that had once made beautiful sounds and had gone silent through neglect or damage or time. It was slow, patient work, the kind that required someone willing to believe an object could be brought back from silence, and Sebastian had built his entire life around that belief because he had once needed to believe it about himself. His wound was this: he had lost his younger brother, Julian, 4 years earlier, to a car accident on the coastal road during a storm that had also, cruelly, been the storm during which Sebastian and Julian had argued for the last time, about nothing, about something so small Sebastian could no longer even remember the substance of it, only the shape of his own voice raised in anger at a brother who would be dead within the hour. Since then, Sebastian had built a life of deliberate quiet. He didn't argue with anyone. He rarely raised his voice, rarely let himself want things loudly enough that losing them might cost him something. His biggest fear was not death. It was regret, the specific, suffocating regret of loving someone and never fully saying so, and then losing the chance forever. He kept this fear buried under routine, under piano keys, under evening walks along the pier where the wind was cold enough to make him feel something, at least, even if that something was only cold. He did not know Theo Reyes well. He knew him the way you know a person from a small town, by sight and reputation, a decent man who worked the boats and kept to himself. He had certainly never suspected that Theo watched him from the pier, had never suspected that anyone watched him at all, because Sebastian Cole had quietly, without meaning to, made himself the kind of person people looked past rather than at. This, more than anything, was why the letter's arrival on a windswept Tuesday evening would strike him with such force. Not because of what it said, but because of the astonishing, disorienting fact that anyone had been looking at him closely enough to write it. Elias arrived at the house on Anchor Street just as the last gray light was draining out of the sky, the letter tucked inside his jacket to keep it dry against the mist already beginning to gather. He knocked twice, the way he always did, and when the door opened, he found himself looking at a man who did not match any image he had built in his head while writing those 4 nights of careful sentences. Sebastian was taller than he'd imagined, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead and eyes that held a wary, searching quality, the look of someone who had trained himself to expect disappointment before it arrived so that it could never catch him unprepared. For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of salt and impending rain, and Elias felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately name, only that it was unfamiliar, and that it arrived without his permission. He held out the letter. Sebastian looked at it, then at him, then took it slowly, as though letters themselves had become suspicious objects in his life, things that only ever seemed to arrive carrying loss. "Who's it from?" he asked, and his voice was quieter than Elias expected, worn soft at the edges like driftwood. Elias, following Theo's explicit instructions, said only that it was from someone who cared for him and hadn't found the courage to say so in person. He did not give the name. Theo had asked for that much privacy, wanting Sebastian to read the words first, unclouded by a name that might color his reaction before he'd had the chance to feel anything honestly. Sebastian studied Elias for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this stranger on his doorstep was trustworthy, and something about the directness of that scrutiny made Elias's pulse behave strangely, an inconvenient fact he filed away and refused to look at. "Thank you," Sebastian said finally, and something in the simple gratitude of those 2 words settled into Elias like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples he wouldn't understand the size of until much later. He turned to go, his job done, the delivery complete, the transaction that should have ended everything right there on that doorstep in the gathering dark. But Sebastian's voice stopped him before he reached the gate. "Will you tell them," Sebastian asked, "that I read it? Whoever they are. I don't know how to reach them, but I'd like them to know I read it and I didn't throw it away." It was such a small request, so carefully hedged, that Elias understood immediately how much courage it had cost Sebastian to make it at all, and he found himself nodding, promising he would pass the message along, already dreading the moment he'd have to deliver it to Theo instead of keeping it, absurdly, for himself. 3 days passed before Elias returned to Anchor Street, ostensibly to deliver Theo's answer, that yes, Theo had heard, and yes, he was overjoyed, and would Sebastian consider meeting him properly, at the pier, this Friday evening, if he was willing, but in truth, Elias had spent those 3 days in a state of quiet, unwelcome turmoil, replaying the shape of Sebastian's eyes in the doorway, the particular sadness in his gratitude, the way he'd asked about the letter's fate with such careful, wounded hope. He told himself this was simple human curiosity, the natural aftermath of playing messenger in someone else's romance. He told himself a great many things over those 3 days, and believed almost none of them. When Sebastian opened the door the second time, there was something different in his face, an alertness that hadn't been there before, as though he had spent the intervening days turning the letter's words over and over until they had worn new grooves into the shape of his hope. "You again," he said, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but its shy cousin. Elias delivered Theo's message exactly as instructed, watching Sebastian's face carefully for the effect of it, and was startled to see something that looked almost like reluctance flicker across his features before he covered it with a polite, grateful nod. "Friday, then," Sebastian said. "Tell him yes." But his eyes lingered on Elias a moment too long as he said it, and Elias walked away from that house with the distinct, uncomfortable sense that the wrong feeling was building in the wrong direction, and that he had no idea, yet, how to stop it. Friday arrived grey and blustery, the sea churning white against the rocks below the pier, and Elias found himself there not because his job required it, but because Theo had begged him to come, terrified of standing alone in front of the man he'd loved silently for 3 years. Elias watched from a distance as Theo waited at the appointed bench, twisting his cap in his rope-scarred hands, and watched, too, as Sebastian arrived precisely on time, his coat collar turned up against the wind exactly as it always was, scanning the pier with an expression of searching hope that made something in Elias's chest twist painfully. But when Sebastian's eyes found Theo, waiting there with his letter-written words rehearsed and ready, they did not light with recognition or relief. They simply looked confused. And when they swept past Theo and landed instead on Elias, standing 30 feet away with his bicycle propped against the railing, something in Sebastian's face opened, unmistakably, entirely, and Elias understood with a sick, plummeting clarity that Sebastian had somehow believed, this whole time, that the letter had come from him. The conversation that followed was one of the most excruciating half-hours of Elias's life. Theo, brave and hopeful, approached Sebastian and began to speak, and Sebastian, to his enormous credit, listened with visible effort and genuine kindness, but the confusion in his eyes never fully cleared, and when Theo finally, gently, asked whether Sebastian had received his letter and understood who it was from, Sebastian's gaze flicked once more toward Elias before he answered, quietly, that he hadn't been certain who had written it, only that whoever had seen him more clearly than anyone had in years. Theo, watching this exchange, was neither foolish nor blind. He understood, with the particular pain of a man who has spent 3 years working up the courage to say 4 words and arrives only to watch someone else receive the answer he'd hoped for, that something had shifted in a direction he had not anticipated and could not control. Theo left the pier alone that evening, and Elias, racked with guilt, went after him, leaving Sebastian standing bewildered by the railing with a letter in his coat pocket that had begun to mean something entirely different to him than it had been intended to mean. He found Theo sitting on an overturned dinghy near the boat sheds, staring out at the water with the particular stillness of a man trying very hard not to fall apart in front of someone. "I wrote it," Elias admitted, the words tearing out of him before he could stop them, because Theo deserved that much honesty even if it cost Elias every ounce of the trust between them. You gave me the truth of what you felt, but I wrote the words. I didn't mean for it to become, I didn't think he'd think it was me. Theo was quiet for a long time, long enough that Elias began to wonder if their friendship, built over 2 decades of shared childhood and mutual reliability, was about to end on this overturned boat in the cold. You didn't do this on purpose, Theo finally said, and his voice, when it came, was rough but not cruel. I know you didn't. But Elias, when you wrote it, whose feelings were you really writing? It was a question that landed like a struck bell, and Elias found he had no honest answer, only the uncomfortable suspicion that somewhere between the 4th night of drafting and delivering the finished letter to Sebastian's door, something Theo had asked him to translate had become, without his permission or awareness, something he had begun to feel for himself. Theo studied his face and seemed to find his answer there, in the silence, because he laughed once, softly, without much humor in it. I've loved him from a distance for 3 years, he said. I think I always knew, somewhere, that it was never going to work the way I hoped. But I didn't expect it to end with me finding out my best friend fell for him through my own letter. Elias wanted to protest, to insist that nothing had happened, that he barely knew Sebastian, that whatever strange current had passed between them on that doorstep was surely just the ordinary confusion of a badly managed delivery. But even as the denials rose in his throat, he knew them for what they were, and Theo, generous even in his own heartbreak, seemed to see the truth before Elias could bring himself to speak it. Go talk to him, Theo said. Properly. Tell him the truth about the letter. He deserves that, whatever happens after. It was, Elias would think later, one of the most quietly heroic things he had ever witnessed a person do, to release a hope he'd carried for 3 years with nothing but grace, asking only that the truth be honored in his place. Elias did not go to Sebastian that night, or the next. He spent 4 days in a state of paralyzed guilt, certain that any version of the truth he told would only cause more damage, that Sebastian had already built an entire tender hope around words that had been written under false pretenses, and that unraveling that hope now, however honestly, would only confirm every fear Sebastian carried about being left, disappointed, discarded by people who turned out not to be who they'd seemed. But on the 5th day, a package arrived at the post office addressed to Elias himself, in handwriting he now recognized instantly, and when he opened it, he found not a letter but a single sheet of music, an original composition, unsigned except for 3 words at the bottom, for the messenger. He rode to Anchor Street with his heart behaving in ways he had no practice managing. Sebastian opened the door before Elias even knocked, as though he'd been waiting at the window, watching the street the way a man watches for something he's afraid to want too openly. You got it, Sebastian said, and there was real vulnerability in his voice, none of the careful reserve from their first meeting. I wasn't sure if it was too strange. A song instead of words. I'm better at songs than words. Elias stood on the doorstep with the sheet music trembling slightly in his hands and understood that the moment for honesty had arrived whether he was ready for it or not, and that continuing to delay it would be its own kind of cruelty. Sebastian, he said, I need to tell you something, and I'm afraid it's going to hurt, and I'm sorry, because you don't deserve to be hurt again by someone who came to your door. He told him everything. The whiskey-soaked confession at the Anchor and Rope. The 4 nights of writing words that belonged, in feeling, to Theo, but had been shaped, sentence by sentence, by Elias's own hands. The unbearable moment on the pier when he'd realized Sebastian had mistaken the messenger for the author. He told it plainly, without excuse, watching Sebastian's face move through confusion, then hurt, then something more complicated that Elias couldn't fully read, and when he finished, the silence between them stretched long enough that Elias became certain he had destroyed something before it had ever properly begun. I should go, Elias said quietly, when the silence became unbearable, and turned to leave, believing this was simply the ending some stories were owed, disappointment folding itself back into the shape it had always threatened to take. Wait, Sebastian said, and something in the single word carried enough weight to stop Elias mid-step. You're telling me Theo asked for the words, and gave you the feelings, and you wrote them. Elias nodded, miserable. But the feelings in that letter, Sebastian continued slowly, working it out as he spoke, the way he might work loose a stuck piano key, kept testing it gently until it gave. They weren't really his feelings translated. They were feelings you built, out of fragments, about a man you'd never even met. That's not translation, Elias. That's not ghostwriting. He stopped, as though hearing the shape of his own realization for the first time and finding it too large to finish out loud. That's you noticing me before you ever saw my face. It was, Elias would think later, the single most frightening and most tender sentence anyone had ever said to him, because it named a truth he had not allowed himself to hold directly until that moment, that somewhere in the writing of those 4 nights, working only from fragments of another man's longing, he had built something that was, unmistakably, his own. I don't know what that means, Elias admitted, and it was the rawest thing he had said aloud in years. I don't know if it's fair to you, or to Theo, or to either of us, for it to have happened this way. Sebastian stepped out onto the porch, closing the door softly behind him against the wind, and stood close enough that Elias could see the fine lines of tiredness around his eyes, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 4 years guarding himself against exactly this kind of unguarded moment. I've spent 4 years being careful, Sebastian said. Careful not to want things too loudly, because the last time I let myself feel something without saying it, I lost the chance to ever say it at all. I don't want to be careful anymore. Not about this. But the story did not resolve itself so simply, because 2 days later, Theo, driven by a guilt of his own, the guilt of a man who had, in his own quiet way, engineered the very deception that had cost him what he wanted, appeared at Sebastian's door to tell him the fuller truth Elias had not known to share, that Theo had loved Sebastian first, longest, and that some part of him still hoped, however faintly, that honesty might yet rearrange the outcome in his favor. It was Sebastian's hardest conversation, standing between the 2 men whose feelings had become tangled together through no one's real malice, and he did what Elias would come to admire more than almost anything else about him. He refused to let guilt make the decision for him. He told Theo, gently and honestly, that he was deeply grateful for the courage Theo had shown in caring for him at all, that Theo's 3 years of quiet devotion deserved to be honored and never dismissed as foolish, but that what had grown between himself and Elias, however strangely it had begun, was not something he could set aside simply because its origins were complicated. Theo, to his lasting credit, accepted this with the same grace he had shown on the overturned boat by the harbor, and though it cost him visibly, he told Sebastian he hoped, someday, the 3 of them might sit together without any of it feeling like a wound. The final test came a month later, on a night when the worst storm of the season rolled in off the water, rain lashing sideways against the windows of Sebastian's narrow house, thunder rattling the old piano strings until they hummed faintly on their own. Sebastian, standing at the window watching the storm that so precisely echoed the one that had taken his brother, found himself paralyzed by an old, familiar terror, the fear that loving someone loudly only ever ended in losing them completely, and in a moment of pure panic, he told Elias he thought they should slow down, should not move so quickly towards something that frightened him more than he had words for. It would have been easy for Elias, who had spent his whole life terrified of being the one left behind, to hear this as rejection and retreat into the same old wound, protecting himself preemptively the way he always had. Instead, he did something he had never once done for himself, he stayed. He sat beside Sebastian at the window, said nothing for a long while, and then told him, quietly, that he understood the fear, that he carried a version of it too, and that he wasn't asking Sebastian to be unafraid, only to let Elias stand beside him inside the fear instead of outside it. I'm not your brother, Elias said. I'm not the storm. I'm just a man who wrote you a letter he didn't know was his own heart, and who wants to keep writing you letters, real ones, for as long as you'll let me. Sebastian wept then, the first time Elias had seen him fully let go of the careful composure he'd worn like armor for 4 years, and when the storm finally passed sometime near dawn, they were still sitting together at that window, the piano silent and patient behind them, waiting, like everything in that house, to be brought gently back to sound. In the spring that followed, Belhaven's fog lifted earlier than usual, and on the evening of the town's small harbor festival, Sebastian sat down at the piano in the front room with the green shutters and played, for the first time in years, the song he had once written and left unsigned except for 3 words. Elias stood in the doorway listening, and Theo, invited now as a friend who had chosen healing over resentment, stood beside him, the three of them having built, slowly and honestly, something none of them could have written into existence on purpose. When the last note faded into the ordinary evening quiet, Sebastian turned from the piano and looked at Elias the way he had looked at him that very first night on the doorstep, before either of them had understood what they were seeing, except now there was nothing careful left in it at all. "I used to think love only ever arrived as loss," Sebastian said. "You taught me it could arrive as a letter delivered to the wrong door, and still be exactly right." Outside, the lighthouse beam swept its slow, patient circle across the water, the same light that had guided Elias home every night of his life, and for the first time, he understood that being needed and being loved were not the same fragile thing he had always feared them to be, that some doors, once opened, stayed open, and some messengers, against every quiet expectation, were allowed to finally stop delivering love for someone else and simply keep it, at last, for themselves. 6 months. After the storm that changed everything, a locked box arrived at Sebastian Cole's door, and inside it was a letter that had been waiting 4 years to be read, written not by Elias, not by Theo, but by the one person Sebastian never thought he'd hear from again. His brother. Julian had died believing he'd never told anyone the truth about himself, and now his handwriting was sitting in Sebastian's trembling hands, ready to unravel every assumption Sebastian had carried about who his brother really was, and why. At the very same time, an opportunity arrived that could take Sebastian away from Belhaven forever, the chance to restore a legendary piano lost for a century, in a city and ocean away from the man he'd only just learned to love without fear. Elias watched him hold both futures in his hands, the past and the possible, and understood that this time, no one could write the ending for either of them. But what Sebastian discovered inside that letter would change not only how he saw his brother, but how he saw himself. The box had been sitting in a storage unit on the mainland for 4 years, forgotten in the chaos that follows a sudden death, when a distant cousin finally cleared out the space and, finding no better solution, shipped its contents to the only remaining Cole in Belhaven. Sebastian did not open it the day it arrived. He set it on the kitchen table and looked at it the way a person looks at a door they are not certain they want to walk through, and for 3 days he simply lived around it, cooking meals in its shadow, playing piano with his back to it, letting Elias's hand rest against his shoulder in the evenings without once mentioning what waited inside the cardboard. Elias did not push him. He had learned, in the months since the storm, that Sebastian's grief moved at its own tide, and that the kindest thing he could offer was simply to remain nearby while it did its slow work, the way lighthouse keepers remain through every kind of weather without demanding the sea explain itself. It was Theo, of all people, who finally gave Sebastian the courage to open it. He had become, in the months since his own quiet heartbreak, an unlikely fixture in both their lives, a friendship rebuilt on the far side of disappointment into something sturdier than either Sebastian or Elias had expected. He came by on a Sunday with a bottle of wine and no particular agenda, and when he saw the box still sitting untouched on the table, he said only, "Whatever's in there already happened, Sebastian. It can't hurt you any more than it already has. But leaving it shut might." It was the kind of plain, harbor-worn wisdom that came easily to a man who spent his days reading currents other people couldn't see, and Sebastian, who had spent 4 years mistaking stillness for safety, found he had no argument against it. Inside the box were ordinary things at first, a wristwatch, a paperback novel with a cracked spine, a photograph of 2 brothers on a beach taken so long ago that Sebastian barely recognized his own younger face in it, unguarded and easy in a way it had not been since. But beneath the photograph, tucked into a plain envelope that had clearly been sealed and unsealed several times, as though its writer had lost his nerve more than once, was a letter addressed simply to Sebastian, dated 11 days before the accident. Sebastian's hands went cold around the paper. Elias, sitting across the table, said nothing, only reached over and rested 2 fingers lightly against Sebastian's wrist, a small anchor, and waited. The letter began the way Julian always used to speak, a little too fast, a little too eager to get past the difficult part, and Sebastian could hear his brother's voice so clearly in the opening lines that he had to stop reading twice just to breathe. Julian wrote that he had been carrying something for years that he'd never found the courage to say, not because he doubted Sebastian's love, but because he doubted his own right to it, that he had fallen for a man 2 summers before, a sailing instructor named Marcus who had since moved away, and that he had let the relationship end quietly rather than risk the conversation he was now, in this letter, finally forcing himself to have. Julian wrote that he had watched Sebastian, his careful, controlled older brother, spend years building a life of quiet safety, and that some secret, stubborn part of himself had always believed that if he waited long enough, he might find in Sebastian an example of how to be brave about who he was. He had been wrong to wait. He wrote that he understood now, or thought he did, that Sebastian's caution wasn't a lesson to follow but a wound of his own, and that he hoped, once he finally said this out loud to his brothers, Sebastian understood then, with a grief so total it emptied him out and refilled him all in the same instant, that the argument he had spent 4 years believing was about nothing had, in fact, been about everything, that Julian had tried to tell him that night, haltingly, imperfectly, and that Sebastian, distracted and irritable after a long week, had cut him off, had said something dismissive about needing to focus on the road in the rain, and Julian, wounded and humiliated by the rejection he mistook it for, had gone quiet for the rest of the drive. The last words between them had not been an argument about nothing. They had been the sound of a door closing on a truth Julian never got to finish opening. Sebastian did not speak for a long time after finishing the letter. He simply sat with it in his lap, staring at his brother's familiar, slanted handwriting, and Elias, watching him, understood that this was not a moment that could be fixed or soothed, only witnessed. When Sebastian finally spoke, his voice was raw in a way Elias had never heard it, not even during the worst of the storm 6 months before. "I've spent 4 years thinking I killed him with an argument," Sebastian said. "It turns out I killed him with impatience. He was trying to tell me the bravest thing he'd ever have to say, and I told him to be quiet because of the rain." Elias moved around the table and knelt beside his chair, taking both of Sebastian's hands in his, and said the only true thing he had to offer: "You didn't kill him, Sebastian. A storm did. A person driving too fast on a wet road did. You were just a brother who didn't yet know what you were interrupting. Julian didn't write this letter to punish you. He wrote it so that someday, you'd know he forgave the silence before you ever needed to ask him to." It took Sebastian nearly 2 weeks to fully surface from the grief the letter reopened, and Elias, true to the promise he had made at the window during the storm, did not try to hurry him through it. He simply stayed, cooking meals Sebastian barely touched at first, sitting quietly in the workshop while Sebastian ran his hands over the piano keys without playing, present in the exact way Sebastian needed without ever demanding to be thanked for it. It was during this fragile stretch of days that the second letter arrived, an actual letter this time, official and formal, from a foundation overseas that restored historic instruments, informing Sebastian that a piano believed lost for over a century, built by a master craftsman whose surviving instruments could be counted on 2 hands, had been discovered in the cellar of an old opera house, and that Sebastian's reputation, quiet, patient, meticulous, had reached them through a chain of recommendations he hadn't even known he'd earned. They wanted him to lead its restoration. The work would take the better part of a year, and it would happen an ocean away, in a city Sebastian had never seen. It was, by any measure, the opportunity of his career, the kind of once-in-a-lifetime honor that restorers spend entire lifetimes hoping might one day find them, and Sebastian read the letter 3 times in the same evening with an expression Elias could not immediately parse, something caught between wonder and dread. When Sebastian finally showed it to him, his hands were shaking slightly, the same tremor Elias had first noticed on the doorstep so many months ago, and Elias understood immediately what the shaking meant even before Sebastian said it aloud. "I don't know how to want something this big," Sebastian admitted, without being terrified of what it costs me to leave. He did not need to say what, or who, he meant by that. The fear was old and familiar to both of them by now, that wanting something loudly, reaching for something fully, was how you ended up losing it, the way he had lost Julian in the space between an unfinished sentence and a wet road. Elias felt his own old wound stir at the thought of Sebastian leaving, the boy who had once believed his father's departure meant he simply hadn't been worth staying for, resurfacing now as a grown man afraid that loving someone meant learning, eventually, to watch them go. It would have been easy, dangerously easy, for Elias to let that fear speak first, to say something small and self-protective that would nudge Sebastian toward staying, toward choosing safety, toward choosing him in a way that cost Sebastian his dream instead of costing Elias his comfort. He recognized the temptation clearly, and it frightened him more than Sebastian's leaving did, because it would have made him exactly the kind of person who takes instead of gives, the very thing he had spent his whole life trying not to become. So instead, sitting across from Sebastian at the kitchen table with Julian's old letter still resting nearby like a quiet witness, Elias said the harder, truer thing. "Go," he said. "Not because I don't want you here. But because I think Julian's whole letter was about the cost of not being brave enough to reach for the thing that scares you. I'm not going to be the reason you learn that lesson and then refuse to live it." Sebastian argued with him about it for 3 days, not because he doubted Elias's sincerity, but because some old, wounded part of him could not yet believe that love and distance could coexist without one destroying the other. It was Theo, again, who offered the peace that finally settled it, arriving one evening with charts and a look of someone who had clearly been thinking about the problem as practically as he thought about tides. "The harbor's slow in the winter months anyway," Theo said. "I've got cousins who'll cover my hulls. I could come with you both, at least for the crossing, help you get settled, see a bit of the world I've never seen." It was, in its own understated way, an act of remarkable generosity, a man offering to help build the very future that had, in its earliest form, cost him the thing he'd wanted most, and Sebastian, hearing it, understood that he was not choosing between love and ambition after all. He was being handed, by 2 men who had every reason to resent the shape his life had taken, permission to have both. They left Belhaven on a clear morning in early autumn, the fog lifted for once, the lighthouse visible from the ferry deck long after the town itself had shrunk to a smudge of green shutters and grey stone against the coastline. Sebastian stood at the railing with Julian's letter folded carefully in his coat pocket, not as a wound anymore, but as a compass, and Elias stood beside him with his hand resting lightly against the small of his back, the same quiet, steady presence he had offered from the very first doorstep delivery, except now there was no letter left to deliver, no secret left to carry for someone else. He was simply there, for himself, for the first time in his life reaching towards something instead of only holding it steady for other people. Theo stood a little apart, watching the water the way he always did, reading its moods, and when Sebastian turned to look back at the shrinking coastline one last time, it was Theo who said, gently, "He'd be proud of you, you know. For going. For letting yourself want the big thing." Sebastian did not need to ask who he meant. The piano, when they finally reached it in the cellar of the old opera house half a world away, was in far worse condition than any photograph had suggested, its frame warped by a century of damp, half its strings long since snapped and coiled uselessly inside its ruined body, and yet Sebastian knelt before it the way he knelt before every broken instrument he had ever touched, with the same unhurried patience, the same unshakable belief that silence was not the same as death, that some things only needed someone willing to sit with them long enough to remember how to sound like themselves again.